For the past 2 years, I have drawn and redrawn my Mermaid in the Ocean speed paint, which was the first video I ever posted onto YouTube. And I figured, why would this year be any different? So I got onto Ibis Paint X, and I started redrawing the illustration, figuring it would go along smoothly and I'd have a good product by the end of it. After all, I had to have improved in a year, right? But my iPad started lagging, so I figured I wouldn't want to deal with that for the entirety of the video, because I would have to do the sketching, the line art, the coloring, and the background, which I'm not as confident in, all with a laggy iPad, at least in terms of digital art. And this was not like average, well, I guess it is average lagging, because it was like 5 seconds behind me whenever I was drawing stuff, so it would not be the same as the way I was drawing it. It would be like I was halfway up the page and it still hadn't reached me in an entire 10 seconds. So I just switched to paper because that is trustworthy. It's not going to lag. It's gonna at least be somewhat better, you know? So I went to paper, and this was 1x1 paper because that is what I've been using for my digital illustrations. So I just kept it the same because I had some 1x1 paper, so why not? So for this, I actually had to completely redo the pose the first time because I don't know if anyone else has this problem, but whenever I draw on paper, I want to make the character really small for some reason. And if anything, that would be worse for me because, again, I'm not as confident with the background, so I didn't feel like dealing with that. Plus, the character is meant to be the main highlight of this. This is the mermaid in the ocean, so it wouldn't be much of a mermaid in the ocean if there's no mermaid. So I had to redraw it, make her slightly bigger, and then I started getting onto the actual pose. For this one, I changed the way the face was. For the second Mermaid in the Ocean speed paint that I did, her face wasn't the exact same face shape as the first one, and looking back at it, it somewhat annoys me, so I tried to make sure that it was at least somewhat the same face shape as the original. Plus, I wanted to make her looking upwards, since in the original and the second one, she's kind of looking towards the skyline, I guess. It's more above the ocean, so I want to make it clear that she is looking up. So I tried to have her whole face looking up and not just her eyeballs trying to stare above her head. So another thing I changed with this one was I also tried to make all the hair flowing with her entire hair, because some of her strands were flowing backwards. And if all of the hair is curving in different directions, it doesn't look as nice in my opinion. So I tried to make the hair strands that were kind of straying from the rest, trying to at least flow in the same direction, since it is still underwater. And moving on to the line art, I did like the way I did the wrinkles, because I liked that it wasn't too heavily emphasized while also showing they were there. But the thing that annoyed me most was the tail fin, because I wanted the line art for the line curving down the tail to be very faint and thin, because there wasn't actually line art for that for the original. So I wanted it to be very thin and not as noticeable, but then I made a mistake, so I had to go over it. So that kind of annoyed me. But thankfully, the rest of the line art went pretty smoothly. I had some line variation. It was looking really nice, so I got to go to the alcohol markers, and it turned out really well. So the skin and the eyes I had no trouble with. The shirt was also pretty good. I realized some of the line art I made with the wrinkles for the shirt had some mistakes, so I just quickly filled them in. For the tail, however, I had to be incredibly careful because there were a lot of small details, and I didn't want to go over them. But the shading I did for that, I actually really liked it, because I felt like it looked somewhat like I added an extra layer as a digital art thing, and I thought that seemed really cool that I could make the shading look somewhat uniform as I went across, so that was nice. The hair, originally, I didn't like it the first time around, because there were a bunch of white spaces, and I thought it wasn't looking all that great. But after taking a step back and then coming to it again, I was like, oh, that's actually not that bad. So, I don't know, I feel like a lot of that was just more taking a step back and not, like, focusing too much on it at that point in time, because I felt like if I was going to change it again, I would have made a mistake with it, so I'm glad I didn't change it. Because I was thinking of adding white highlights, and in the end, I'm glad I didn't do that. Same with the mouth, because I was thinking of adding red to it to kind of differentiate between the mouth and the teeth, but I'm glad I didn't do that like I did with the originals, because this is traditional and I didn't want the marker to bleed everywhere and cause more messes than fixes, so I'm glad I didn't do that. Moving on to the background, this is where I felt like I was starting to struggle a bit, because I'm not that great at backgrounds, or at least I'm not as experienced with it. I don't do it as often as I do characters. So once I started getting to the sand, I'm like, oh shoot, what am I going to do here? Because that was the part where I started struggling the most with the other two illustrations. So when I get to here for this one, it's like, where do I go from here? So I started shading, and I realized a lot of the shadows were on the right side of the character. So I was like, okay, I'm going to put the shadows for the sand on the right as well. So I made it seem like, or at least vaguely make it seem like the shadows for the character were going towards the right side. And I added little specks and dots of the markers to make it seem like there were actually specks of sand along there, and I actually really like that effect. I feel like I did really well with that. And then I added more colors to make it seem like there was more shading, add more dots, etc., make it seem like there's sand. And I also added some little, I guess, divots to make it seem like the sand isn't entirely uniform, because if you go onto like a beach or anywhere with sand, it's not going to be entirely uniform. There's going to be some hills and dips and things like that. I also added white gel pen in, and I really liked that. I feel like that really enhanced the sand, because sand isn't going to be just like yellow or brown. There's also going to be like some white and things in there, so I felt like that really enhanced the feeling that it is in fact sand. So I really liked that. Moving on to the top and bottom of the ocean, this was where I felt like I really had to trust the process with the art, because at the beginning, I was like, I don't know where I'm going with this, I'm just gonna trust past me with this and hope it works. And that was not a good idea. It's not that past me was necessarily wrong, it's just I was going about it without a reference. So I was just kind of filling stuff in and hoping it worked. And that kind of works to an extent, but you should really have a reference for what you're doing. So here's where I finally started to actually pull up a reference for water. And here's where I started realizing that, oh yeah, past me kind of had a point with what I was doing. But I just didn't know how to execute it as well. And I didn't know how to execute it that well at the beginning either, so I had to like kind of realize, oh hey, where there's dark parts, there's actually trying to do shading, so I need to put more darkness at the back to kind of show that there's perspective and that there's actually a lot more water past where I'm going. I'm just filling in more darks and white spaces to make it seem like it's further away than it actually is. And once I started realizing the shading and why there was shading, it made the top and bottom so much easier. And same with the light and how all that was working. That really helped me out. But the middle, again, same thing. I didn't quite know what I was doing, so I was just kind of putting color on the paper and hoping it worked. And in the end, I feel like I got to an okay spot. I kind of wish I did slightly better, but it was really good. I felt like I improved from last year. And another thing that was happening with the middle is that I was kind of having dried out markers. So that was kind of annoying. And I was trying to do shading on the edges a lot, trying to make it seem like there was a lot more darkness over there compared to the middle and right behind the mermaid. And I also tried adding some green and other light markers to try to add some more variation and try to hide the streakiness that was happening. And I feel like that really helped a lot to add more saturated markers, because it turns out when you use an entire marker for a really large space, it'll start to dry out. So adding more markers will help make it seem less dried out. Also, I feel like it added a little bit more depth to what was happening, because I feel like I was trying to make it seem like there was streaks of light coming down, which was the part that I really liked from the 2021 illustration, so I was trying to carry that over to this one, bring the goods from both the 2020 and 2021 into the 2022. So with that concludes our 2022 speed paint. Let me know in the comments down below, which illustration do you like better? The 2021 version, the 2020 version, or the 2022 version? And if you haven't seen the videos for the 2021 and 2020 speed paints, you can see them in a playlist right over here. So with that, I hope you all have a magnificent day, and I will see you all later.